At 9:15 a.m. on the 28th of December, 1889, the general store in the small settlement of Bison Creek, Dakota Territory, opened its doors as usual. The owner, a man named Jacob Miller, had been up since 4 in the morning arranging shelves, checking inventory, and sweeping the wooden floor. The store was a long, narrow building with a false front, a single window, and a sign that read Miller's Mercantile, Dry Goods, Groceries, Hardware. The air smelled of coffee, tobacco, and kerosene. Everything seemed normal. The stove in the back room had been lit, and the first customers were expected within the hour. Only a few minutes later, something was off. Miller noticed the empty space on the shelf where the flour should have been. He had ordered 300 pounds of flour from the wholesaler in Sioux Falls, along with salt, sugar, and coffee. The shipment was supposed to arrive the day before by wagon, but it had not come. He checked the calendar. The wagon was now 2 days late. Miller stepped outside and looked down the road. Nothing but snow and silence. The temperature was below zero. The nearest telegraph station was 40 miles away. The nearest railhead was 150 miles. His wife, Sarah, came out and asked if he wanted to postpone opening. He shook his head. People would come anyway, looking for news and warmth if nothing else. By noon, a small crowd had gathered in the store. The men sat on barrels and crates, talking about the weather, the price of cattle, the possibility of statehood. The women examined bolts of calico and discussed recipes. Children pressed their noses to the glass jar of peppermint sticks. But beneath the chatter was a quiet unease. Miller's store held the only supply of flour in Bison Creek. Without it, the town's bread would run out in 3 days. There was no backup. The nearest alternative was a settlement called Willow Creek, a 4-day round trip in good weather. This was not good weather. What happened to the wagon? Miller had hired a teamster named Ezra Tolliver to make the run to Sioux Falls every month. Tolliver was reliable. He had made the trip for 2 winters without incident. He left Sioux Falls on the 21st of December with a load of goods for 3 different stores in the territory. The weather reports from that week showed a blizzard moving into the region on the 22nd. Tolliver likely tried to outrun it. He may have taken a shortcut through the Badlands. He may have stopped at a way station. No one knew. The road was not patrolled. There was no search and rescue. The only way to find out was to send a party out to look. This was not an unusual situation on the frontier. General stores were the lifelines of remote settlements. They were not simply places to buy goods. They were banks, post offices, community centers, news exchanges, and emergency shelters. In a town like Bison Creek, which had no church, no schoolhouse, no courthouse, no saloon even, the general store was the only public building. Town meetings were held there. Wills were witnessed there. Marriages were sometimes performed in the back room. The storekeeper was often the most trusted man in the community, the unofficial mayor, the credit lender, the keeper of secrets. Jacob Miller had opened his store in 1883, 6 years before that December morning. He had come from Ohio with a small inheritance and a belief that the frontier needed reliable supplies. He built the store himself, using lumber hauled from the Black Hills. He stocked it with everything a homesteading family could need: axes, nails, plows, seeds, boots, hats, blankets, thread, medicine, spices, candy, ammunition, and whiskey. He also stocked items that were not strictly necessary but made life less harsh: a few books, a fiddle, a box of photographs, a glass case of pocket watches. He extended credit to families who could not pay until harvest. He bartered eggs for salt, hides for coffee. He kept a ledger in which he recorded every transaction, every debt, every payment. That ledger, now held in a historical archive, shows the rhythms of a frontier economy: $1 for a bag of flour, 50 cents for a pound of sugar, 2 cents for a candle. The margins were thin, but Miller survived. How did the general store become the heart of every frontier town? The answer lies in geography and economics. The Homestead Act of 1862 distributed land to settlers across the Great Plains, but it did not distribute the infrastructure to support them. Towns grew around natural resources: water, timber, ore, but also around points of exchange. Rivers and railroads became corridors, but most settlements were not on the main line. They were scattered across hundreds of miles of open prairie, separated by distances that could not be traveled quickly. In such conditions, a single building could become the center of a community by necessity. The general store served as the point of connection between the isolated homestead and the wider world. Wagon trains brought goods from the east and from ports like St. Louis and Chicago. Those goods were then distributed to the stores, which then distributed them to the families. Without the store, a family might have to travel weeks to obtain a single spool of thread or a bottle of quinine. The store compressed that distance. It also compressed time. A weekly stagecoach delivered mail and newspapers. The storekeeper read the papers aloud to those who could not read. News of wars, elections, disasters, and inventions arrived at the store before it reached anywhere else. The store was the communication network, but it was also the financial system. Cash was scarce on the frontier. Most transactions were conducted through credit or barter. A farmer would bring in a load of wheat or corn, and the storekeeper would credit his account. The farmer would then draw on that credit over the winter to buy flour, salt, and coal oil. The storekeeper took the agricultural produce and either sold it locally or shipped it to markets. This system was fragile. A drought, a grasshopper plague, or a low price for wheat could leave the storekeeper holding worthless debt. Many stores failed, but the ones that survived became institutions. Their owners became pillars of the community. In Bison Creek, the missing wagon was not just a logistical inconvenience. It was a threat to the entire winter survival of the town. Without flour, there would be no bread. Without salt, there would be no way to preserve meat. Without coffee, there would be no comfort in the long, dark evenings. Miller did not panic. He took stock of what he had. He had enough flour for 3 more days at normal consumption. He had a reserve of hardtack from a previous shipment. He had a small herd of goats that could provide milk. He had dried beans and potatoes. But the calendar said January was coming, and January was the worst month. The blizzard could last a week. The temperature could drop to 40 below. A search party would be dangerous. At 2:30 p.m. that same day, a man named Otis Cranston walked into the store. Cranston was a trapper who lived alone in a cabin 12 miles north. He had not been to town in 3 weeks. He said he had seen tracks east of his cabin 2 days ago, wagon tracks heading toward Bison Creek, then veering off the road. He had followed them for a while but lost them in the snow. Miller asked if he could lead a party to the spot. Cranston said he could, but it would mean a night in the cold. Miller agreed. He gathered 3 men, each with a rifle, a blanket, and a flask of whiskey. He told his wife to keep the store open for as long as people needed it. Then they left at 3:15 p.m. on the 28th of December, 1889. The search took 2 days. The party followed Cranston's tracks, then found the wagon on the morning of the 30th, overturned in a ravine 9 miles from town. The horses were dead, frozen in their harnesses. The driver, Ezra Tolliver, was found in a snowdrift 50 yards away. He had tried to walk for help and had not made it. The cargo was scattered but mostly intact. The flour was still in sacks, though some had burst. The salt was dry. The coffee was fine. Miller and the men spent the day salvaging what they could, loading it onto the wagon they had brought, and bringing Tolliver's body back on a sled. When they returned to Bison Creek on the evening of the 31st of December, the town gathered at the store. Miller opened a barrel of apples and a keg of beer. He told everyone that the supplies were safe. The store would be open on the 1st of January as usual. He also announced that Tolliver's widow would receive his full share of the salvage profits and that the store would cover her rent for the next 6 months. No one objected. The storekeeper was not just a merchant. He was the safety net. This story is one of hundreds like it, recorded in diaries, letters, and county histories. The general store was never just a building. It was the center of gravity for the frontier. It held the community together through isolation, disaster, and change. It was where strangers became neighbors, where debts were forgiven, where news was shared, and where hope was measured in pounds of flour and gallons of kerosene. The systems that supported it, the wagon routes, the credit ledgers, the barter agreements, the storekeeper's judgment, were the arteries of expansion. They were not perfect. They failed often. But when they worked because they were personal. The general store was a face, a name, a handshake. What investigators might find if such a concept applied is that the general store's importance was not in the goods it sold, but in the trust it embodied. The storekeeper knew every family's circumstances. He knew who was sick, who was pregnant, who had lost a cow, who had a son in the army. He adjusted credit accordingly. He extended grace. He also collected when he had to. The ledger was honest. The store was the bank of last resort. In many frontier towns, the storekeeper was the only person who could read a contract, calculate interest, or negotiate with a wholesaler. The store was the center of literacy and numeracy. The aftermath of the missing wagon in Bison Creek was not a national tragedy. It was a local event, barely recorded beyond the county newspaper. but it reveals the fragility and the resilience of frontier life. The store did not just sell goods, it absorbed risk. It distributed risk. It was a microcosm of the entire westward expansion, a system built on one man's judgment, a single wagon, and a community's willingness to wait. The deep question is not whether the general store was important. It is whether any community can survive without a central point of exchange and trust. The general store at Bison Creek survived that winter. Miller expanded it the following year, adding a post office counter and a room for the traveling doctor. The settlement grew. It became a town with a school, a church, a bank. The general store remained the heart even as the frontier faded into the 20th century. What happened to Miller's ledger is known. It was passed down through his family, then donated to a historical society. The store itself is gone, demolished in the 1960s, but the pattern it established, the idea of a single place where a community gathers, trusts, trades, and survives, has not disappeared. It has simply changed form. The story remains significant because it asks us to consider what holds a community together when there is no government, no police, no insurance, no formal safety net. The answer in the case of Bison Creek and countless similar towns was the general store. It was not perfect. It could be expensive, limited, and dependent on the honesty of one person, but it was there. And when the wagon did not arrive, the storekeeper did not close the doors. He went out into the snow to find it. At 9 a.m. on the 12th of March, 1877, in the town of Prairie Glen, Kansas, the general store of James H. Tabor received a telegram. The store was the only building with a telegraph connection. The line had been strung by the railroad the previous autumn, and Tabor had paid for the receiver out of his own pocket. The message was from a wholesaler in Topeka. A train carrying goods for the store had derailed 30 miles east. The shipment was delayed indefinitely. Tabor read the message twice, then placed it on the counter. He did not panic. He looked at his ledger, counted his inventory, and began rationing. He had enough kerosene for 6 weeks, but flour would run out in 10 days. He sent word to the town's families via the post office counter. The store was not just a store. It was the early warning system. What happened next was not a crisis. It was a routine adjustment. The town had survived worse. The harvest the previous year had been destroyed by hail. The winter before that, a blizzard had buried the stagecoach for 2 weeks. The general store had been the one constant. Tabor had extended credit to farmers who had no income. He had bartered seed corn for labor. He had stored grain for the mill until it could be ground. When the train derailed, the store absorbed the shock. Families reduced their consumption. They ate more venison and less flour. They used tallow candles instead of kerosene. The store did not close. Tabor ordered a special wagon from Abilene at double the normal cost. It arrived on the 25th of March with enough flour and salt to last until the railroad was repaired. But the deeper story is not about the derailment. It is about how Prairie Glen was structured. The town had no bank, no church, no schoolhouse, no mayor. It had a railroad depot, a blacksmith, a saloon, and Tabor's store. The store was the de facto government. Tabor mediated disputes. He held the town's spare cash in his safe. He wrote letters for illiterate settlers. He kept the only copy of the county land records. When a family lost a child to diphtheria, Tabor arranged the burial and sent the bill to the county. He did not charge interest. The store was the welfare system. How could this have happened? The answer is simple. The frontier was too spread out for formal institutions. The nearest bank was in Topeka, a 3-day ride. The nearest church was in a settlement 40 miles north. The nearest school was a one-room affair that met only in summer. The general store filled the gaps because it was already there. It had the space, the goods, the credit, and the trust. Tabor was not a trained banker or a pastor or a judge. He was a merchant, but he became all those things by necessity. The store was the only place where everyone came, everyone talked, and everyone owed something or was owed something. Investigators of the period, if they had existed, would have found that the store's ledgers were the most complete record of community life. They listed births, deaths, marriages, debts, crops, weather, and gossip. Tabor kept a diary. He recorded the date of the first frost, the price of wheat, the arrival of new settlers, the outbreak of sickness. He noted when a neighbor's horse was stolen and when a child was born. His store was the town's memory. When the county assessor needed population figures, he asked Tabor. When the railroad wanted to know how many tons of freight to expect, Tabor gave the number. The general store was the Census Bureau. The aftermath of the derailment in Prairie Glen was unremarkable. The goods arrived. The town survived. Tabor eventually sold the store in 1892 and moved to California. The building burned down in 1901, but the pattern repeated across thousands of towns. The general store was the heart because it was the only organ that could pump information, goods, and credit into the farthest capillaries of settlement. It was not a coincidence that many towns were founded around a store. The store came first. Then came the post office, the church, the school, the bank. The store was the seed. The question that remains is whether the general store was a product of necessity or of human nature. The evidence suggests both. The frontier forced people to rely on a single point of exchange. But the form that point took, a wooden building with a porch, a counter, a stove, and a ledger, was shaped by the people who ran it. Storekeepers like Tabor and Miller were not entrepreneurs in the modern sense. They were community anchors. They accepted risk that no insurance company would touch. They extended credit to people who might never pay. They stored goods for families who had no place to store them. They were the bank, the warehouse, the post office, the newsroom, the pharmacy, and the tavern all in one. At 4:30 p.m. on the 4th of July, 1886, in the town of Carson Flats, Nebraska, the general store of William H. Grafton became the scene of an impromptu celebration. The town had no official Independence Day observance. Grafton brought out a case of fireworks, a keg of lemonade, and a barrel of apples. He nailed an American flag to the porch. He read the Declaration of Independence from a newspaper clipping. He then announced that any child under 12 could have a free piece of candy. The store was the town square. It was the place where community identity was formed. Grafton understood this. He had built the store in 1874, when Carson Flats was just a name on a map. He had traded goods for labor to help build the first church. He had lent money to the school board to buy books. He had negotiated with the railroad to bring a spur line to the town. The store was his instrument, but the community was his purpose. What investigators might learn from Grafton's ledgers is that the store's credit system was based less on collateral and more on character. Grafton knew which farmers were honest and which were lazy. He knew which families would pay back their debts and which would need to be forgiven. He kept two sets of books, one for the wholesalers and one for his own memory. The second set was not written. It was stored in his mind. He remembered that the widow Jensen had lost her husband in a thrashing accident. He remembered that the Peterson boy had died of typhoid. He remembered that the Schultz family had given him a side of bacon when his own cow had died. The store's economy was personal. It was a web of obligations, favors, and trust. This system was fragile. It depended on one man's judgment and honesty. When a storekeeper died or went bankrupt, the town's economic life could collapse. Grafton was careful. He diversified. He took grain, livestock, butter, eggs, and firewood as payment. He sold to other towns. He maintained a cash reserve. He also kept a rifle behind the counter and a revolver in his desk. Not everyone paid. Some tried to steal. Some threatened him. The general store was not a utopia. It was a frontier business with the edge of a knife. But the failures are also instructive. When a store failed, it was often because the community itself was failing. Drought, crop pests, falling prices, or war could destroy the entire local economy. The storekeeper could not survive alone. He needed the town to thrive. The general store was not a parasite. It was a symbiont. It lived and died with the settlement. In that sense, the store was the purest expression of the frontier. Self-reliant, risky, personal, and temporary. The story of the general store remains significant because it shows how communities function without formal infrastructure. The frontier was a place where government arrived late, if at all. The general store was the provisional government. It was the court, the bank, the post office, the pharmacy, the grocery, and the town hall. It was also the place of loneliness. A man could walk into a general store on a winter evening, sit by the stove, and say nothing for an hour. The storekeeper would not ask why. He would stoke the fire and wait. The store was the hearth. At 8 p.m. on the 22nd of December, 1891, in the town of Rock Springs, Wyoming, the general store of Thomas E. Landers served as the site of a wedding ceremony. The justice of the peace was 20 miles away. Landers had a copy of the laws and a Bible. He married the couple himself. He signed the certificate. He gave them a sack of flour as a wedding gift. The store was the sanctuary. It was where life's milestones were marked. Births, deaths, marriages, farewells, homecomings, all were witnessed at the counter. The store was the repository of memory. How could one building hold so much? Because the frontier was built on scarcity. Land was cheap, but everything else was expensive. The general store concentrated the essentials. It was the only place where a man could buy a plow, a dress pattern, a bottle of medicine, a box of ammunition, a sack of sugar, and a newspaper. It was the only place where a woman could sell her butter and her eggs. It was the only place where children could buy a stick of candy. It was the only place where news from the outside world arrived. The store was the center of the known universe. The systems that supported the general store were themselves frontier institutions. The wholesalers in St. Louis, Chicago, and Kansas City shipped goods by rail and river. The storekeeper placed orders based on estimates of demand. He had to guess what people would need months in advance. He had to judge the weather, the harvest, the market, and the mood of the town. He was a meteorologist, an economist, a psychologist, and a logistician. When he guessed wrong, the town suffered. When he guessed right, the town thrived. In Bison Creek, Miller's guess was right. He found the wagon. He saved the winter. But he also knew that luck was part of the equation. The next winter might bring a deeper snow. The next wagon might not come at all. The next blizzard might bury the entire settlement. The general store was not invincible. It was merely the best system available. The people of the frontier accepted this. They built their lives around the store not because it was perfect, but because it was there. The legacy of the general store is not in its physical remains. Most are gone. Their sites are parking lots or empty fields. But the pattern endures in rural co-ops, community centers, and corner stores. The need for a central point of exchange and trust has not disappeared. It has only changed its shape. The general store was the first network. It was the original social safety net. It was the heart, and when it stopped beating, the town often died with it. This is why the story matters. It is not just about flour and coffee. It is about how people survive when they have nothing except each other and a single building with a pot-bellied stove. The general store was the proof that community is not a location. It is a set of relationships held together by trust. The storekeeper was the keeper of that trust. He kept the ledger. He kept the door open. He kept the fire burning. And when the wagon did not arrive, he went out into the snow to find it. At 3:15 a.m. on the 17th of January, 1888, a fire started in the back storeroom of the general store in Ashland, Kansas. The store was owned by Isaac B. Horton, a man who had arrived in Ashland 5 years earlier with a wagon load of dry goods and a single kerosene lamp. The fire began near a barrel of lamp oil. Horton had stored it too close to the wood stove that was left burning overnight. The flames spread through the storeroom within minutes. The store was a wooden building with no fire break. The walls, the floor, the shelves, all of it was dry pine. By the time Horton woke to the smell of smoke, the storeroom was fully engulfed. He ran out into the street in his nightshirt. He began shouting for help. The town had no fire department. The nearest fire company was 40 miles away in Garden City. The residents of Ashland formed a bucket brigade, passing water from a well 2 blocks away. but the water was frozen in the bucket. They had to use snow. They threw snow on the flames. It did not matter. The fire had already reached the main sales floor. Within 30 minutes, the entire building was gone. What happened next tells us something about the role of the general store in a frontier town. Horton lost everything. The inventory was uninsured. There was no insurance agent within 100 miles. Horton had no savings. He had put all his capital into the winter stock. The town's only source of dry goods, tools, medicine, and food had disappeared in a single hour. But the community did not let the store die. The next morning, the town's farmers met at the schoolhouse. They passed a hat. Each family contributed what they could. A man named Cooper gave $10 cash, a month's wages. A widow named Jensen gave $5 she had saved for her son's funeral. Another man gave a side of beef. The local blacksmith offered to forge new hinges and nails for free. The town's carpenter offered to rebuild the store at cost. Horton was not a rich man, but he was a trusted man. The store was not just his business, it was the town's lifeblood. By February 1888, Horton had a new building. It was smaller. The lumber was green. The roof was tar paper, but it was open. The inventory was replaced by credit from wholesalers in Wichita who had known Horton for years. He paid them back over the next 3 seasons. The store survived. The town survived. The fire did not end Ashland. It proved that the general store was not just a building, it was a relationship. And relationships, if they are strong enough, can survive even fire. This story is not unique. Across the frontier, general stores burned. They burned because they were made of wood, heated by stoves, lit by lamps, and filled with flammable goods. They burned because there was no fire protection. They burned because the frontier was dangerous, but they were rebuilt because the community needed them. The general store was not replaceable by another store. It was replaceable only by the trust of the people. At 6 p.m. on the 12th of March, 1892, a blizzard struck the town of Pine Ridge, Nebraska. The storm was sudden. It came from the north without warning. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. The wind reached 70 miles per hour. Snow fell at a rate of 3 inches per hour. The town was isolated. The railroad line was buried. The telegraph wires snapped. The general store in Pine Ridge was owned by a man named James A. Morrison. Morrison had been a storekeeper for 11 years. He had seen blizzards before. He knew that the store was the only building in town with a large enough stock of food, medicine, fuel, and blankets to sustain the community for more than a few days. He also knew that the store had a pot-bellied stove that could heat the main room. He opened the doors to anyone who needed shelter. 20 families arrived that night. They brought their children, their elderly, their livestock in some cases. Morrison rationed the food. He set a limit of 2 meals per person per day. He used the store's coal and wood to keep the stove burning. He distributed blankets, hats, and boots from the inventory. He kept a ledger of everything. He did not ask for payment. He knew that the harvest had been poor the previous year. He knew that many families would not be able to pay until spring. He extended credit without a second thought. The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the fourth day, the sun came out. The snow was deep. The roads were impassable, but the town had survived. Morrison's store had been the refuge. He had used his inventory as a lifeline. He had not counted the cost. He had simply acted. What investigators of this event, if there were any, would find is that Morrison's store was the only reason no one died in Pine Ridge that March. There were no official reports, no commendations, no government relief funds. The town simply continued. Morrison's ledger showed that the debts were paid slowly over the next 2 years. Some were never paid. Morrison did not complain. He understood that the store's purpose was not profit, it was survival. The pattern repeats. In every frontier town, the general store was the safety net. It was not designed as a charity, it was a business. But its business depended on the community's well-being. If the town died, the store died. So the storekeeper acted not out of altruism alone, but out of self-interest. Altruism and self-interest were the same thing. The store was the community. The community was the store. At 9 a.m. on the 15th of October, 1895, in the town of Cedar Springs, Colorado, the general store of Margaret H. Franklin became the site of the first telephone in the county. Franklin had purchased the equipment from a traveling salesman. She installed the line to the railroad station 5 miles away. The telephone was a novelty. Most people did not know how to use it. Franklin taught them. She charged a fee of 10 cents per call. The calls were not private. They were made in the back of the store with the door open so everyone could hear. The store was the communications center. What happened over the next decade is that the telephone changed the town. Farmers could check grain prices before they brought their harvest to the depot. Families could call for a doctor. The store became the information hub. Franklin's store was not just a place for goods. It was a place for news, for coordination, for connection. The general store had already been the center of social life. The telephone made it the center of the network. How did a single storekeeper manage such a role? The answer is that the frontier did not have specialists. There was no separate postmaster, no separate telephone company, no separate bank. The general store absorbed all those functions. It was the default institution. When a new technology arrived, it landed in the store because the store was the only place where people already gathered. Franklin ran the telephone service for 12 years. She kept the bills in a cigar box. She never charged for emergency calls. She allowed children to call their grandparents for free on Sundays. She understood that the store was not just a business. It was a public utility. The store's ledger recorded the calls. It also recorded debts, barter transactions, letters sent, and packages received. The store was the memory of the town. At 2 p.m. on the 21st of May, 1903, in the town of Millbrook, Iowa, the general store of Daniel P. Thornton hosted a town meeting. The issue was whether to build a new school. The school board had no funds. Thornton offered to loan the town the money at 0 interest. He had the cash from the store's profits. He had been saving for a new roof. He decided the roof could wait. The meeting was held on the porch. Thornton brought out chairs. He served coffee and crackers. The townspeople debated for 4 hours. Thornton did not vote. He sat in the back. He listened. At the end, the vote was in favor of the school. Thornton wrote a check on the spot. He handed it to the school board president. The school was built the following summer. It was named Thornton School. What does this story reveal? It reveals that the general store was not a passive building. It was an active agent in community development. The storekeeper was not merely a seller of goods. He was a leader. He had resources. He had influence. He had the trust of the people. He used these things to shape the community. Thornton's store survived the 1900s, but by the 1920s, the automobile and the chain store began to change the pattern. Farmers could drive to the county seat. They could buy from Sears Roebuck. The general store lost its monopoly. Thornton refused to adapt. He kept the same inventory, the same hours, the same credit system. By 1927, the store was losing money. Thornton died in 1930. The store closed the same year. The building became a garage. The school still stands. The decline of the general store was not sudden. It was gradual. It was caused by roads, cars, radio, and catalogs. But the fundamental structure of the frontier store, the trust, the credit, the personal relationships, did not disappear. It moved to other forms. The rural cooperative, the credit union, the community center. The store was the prototype. At 5:30 p.m. on the 8th of November 1912 in the town of Willow Creek, Montana, the general store of Samuel T. Reed became the scene of a shooting. Reed had refused credit to a man named Hollister. Hollister had a reputation for violence. He had been drinking. He came back with a revolver. He demanded cash. Reed reached under the counter for his own gun. He fired first. Hollister died on the floor. The sheriff ruled it self-defense. The aftermath was complicated. Some townspeople thought Reed was too quick with his gun. Others thought he had no choice. The store remained open, but the atmosphere changed. Reed stopped selling ammunition. He stopped staying late. He sold the store in 1904. The new owner was a woman named Eleanor Vance. She ran the store without a gun. She relied on persuasion and goodwill. She lasted until 1909. The story is not an outlier. Violence was part of the frontier. The general store was a place of tension. Debt, disputes, and grudges often converged at the counter. The storekeeper had to be judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. It was a dangerous job. The ledger held not just numbers but the seeds of conflict. The store was the crossroads of every human emotion, but it was also the place of resolution. The same counter where a man threatened a storekeeper was the same counter where a woman sold her butter and her eggs. The same stool where a debtor begged for more time was the same stool where a child's birthday was celebrated. The general store contained all of life. It was not simple. It never was. What remains today is the memory. We cannot visit these stores. Most are gone, but we can read their ledgers. We can trace their timestamps. We can understand what they meant. The general store was the heart of every frontier town because it was the only place where the heart could beat. It was the center of exchange, the center of trust, the center of community. It was the proof that even in the loneliest places, people find a way to build a home. At 7 a.m. on the 1st of April, 1900, in the town of Dry Fork, Texas, the general store of William T. Carson opened for business as usual. The town had a population of 62. Carson had been the only storekeeper for 20 years. He knew every soul. That morning, a young man named Earl came in to buy a box of bullets. Carson asked him what he was hunting. Earl said he was hunting his father. The story is not one of violence alone. It is about the burden of knowledge. Carson knew that Earl's father was an abusive man. He knew that the sheriff had been called before. He knew that the town had turned a blind eye. Carson sold the bullets. He did not say anything. That afternoon, Earl shot his father on the road east of town. The sheriff arrested Earl. Carson testified at the trial. He said he had known the boy was in trouble but did not think he would act. The jury convicted Earl of murder. He was hanged. The storekeeper carried the guilt for years. He had not intervened. He had not refused the sale. He had followed the rules. But the rules of the frontier were not the rules of a courtroom. The storekeeper was not a law officer. He was a supplier. He was also a human being. The story is a reminder that the general store was not a utopia. It was a place where real decisions had to be made, sometimes with terrible consequences. The general store was not a single story. It was 1,000 stories. Some were joyful, some were tragic, some were ordinary. Together, they form the history of the frontier. The store was the constant. It was the one building that could hold all of them. It still does in the pages of old ledgers, in the memories of descendants, in the foundations of the towns that survived and those that did not. We cannot go back to that time, but we can understand it. The general store was a system. It was a system of trust, of credit, of communication, of survival. It was a system that worked because it was personal. It failed when it became impersonal. The lesson is that community is built on relationships, not on transactions. The storekeeper knew that. He kept the ledger. He kept the stove burning. He kept the door open. And when the wagon did not arrive, he went out into the snow to find it. That is the story. At 8:15 a.m. on the 12th of September, 1887, in the town of Pine Ridge, Nebraska, the general store of Martha H. Klein received a telegraph message. It was the first telegraph in the county. The line had been strung along the railroad tracks just 3 days earlier. The message read, "Stop shipment of flour. Price dropped. New order coming." Martha read it twice. She had already ordered 200 pounds of flour from Omaha. She had sold half of it on credit. The price drop would lose her money, but she could still break even if she canceled the order in time. She walked to the post office, which was actually her own back room, and sent a reply. Then she walked back to the counter and told the waiting farmers. The flour they had bought on credit was now overpriced, but Martha absorbed the loss. She did not charge them the difference. She kept the original price. Why did she do this? Because the store was the glue. Martha knew that if she passed the price drop onto her customers, they would feel cheated. They remembered the price they had agreed to. If she lowered it now, they would question every future price. But if she kept it high, they would owe more than the flour was worth. She chose to bear the cost. The ledger showed a loss of $12. That was a week's profit. But the trust held. Martha Klein ran the Pine Ridge store for 27 years. She was widowed at 32. Her husband had died of pneumonia after falling through ice on the Platte River. She had no children. She took over the store because no one else would. The banker in the county seat told her she could not run a business alone. She proved him wrong. She learned to read the ledgers, to negotiate with traveling salesmen, to judge when to extend credit and when to demand cash. She stocked school books, hymnals, patent medicines, and horse liniment. She also kept a small library of novels on a shelf near the stove. People paid a nickel to borrow a book for a week. She used that money to buy new books. Her store became the town's reading room. Children came after school to do homework by the oil lamp. Martha corrected their spelling. She sent letters for illiterate farmers. She wrote to the state land office on behalf of settlers trying to prove up claims. She was not a teacher or a lawyer. She was a storekeeper. But she was also everything the community needed. At 2 p.m. on the 3rd of January, 1893, the store caught fire. A spark from the stove ignited a barrel of kerosene. Martha was in the back room. She smelled smoke. She ran out front. The flames were already climbing the wall. She grabbed the ledger and the cash box. She ran out the door. The building burned to the ground in 20 minutes. The town had no fire department. Neighbors formed a bucket brigade, but the well was dry. They could only watch. The loss was total. Martha had no insurance. She had always meant to buy it, but the premiums were high and she kept putting it off. Now she had nothing. The townspeople brought her food and blankets. They offered her a room at the boarding house. She stayed there for 3 weeks, but she was not finished. She borrowed money from the banker who had doubted her. She signed a note at 10% interest. She used it to buy a tent and a wagon load of goods. She set up a temporary store on the same lot. She worked from dawn until dark. By summer, she had repaid the loan. By the end of the year, she had built a new wooden store larger than the old one. How could she do that? She had the trust of the community. They had seen her absorb the flour loss. They had seen her rescue the ledger. They had seen her refuse to raise prices after the fire. When she needed credit from the wholesalers, they granted it. When she needed labor to build the new store, men worked for wages she could not pay immediately. They waited. The store went up in 6 weeks. The general store was not just a building, it was a relationship. Martha Klein embodied that. She understood that the store's capital was not the inventory on the shelves. It was the goodwill in the hearts of the people. That goodwill could be spent, but it also had to be replenished. She did that every day with small gestures. She gave candy to children. She let a widow pay for a sack of flour in installments, 1 egg at a time. She wrote letters for soldiers far from home. She remembered birthdays. At 9:30 a.m. on the 17th of March, 1906, a salesman from a Chicago hardware company visited Martha's store. He offered her a contract to sell his new line of cast-iron stoves. The stoves were efficient and cheap. He wanted her to order a dozen. Martha said no. She told him she could not sell stoves that burned less wood because the farmers in Pine Ridge earned extra money selling firewood. An efficient stove would hurt their income. The salesman was confused. He had never heard a storekeeper decline a product to protect her customers' livelihoods. He left without a sale. Martha Klein died in 1992. She collapsed behind the counter while sorting mail. The store was closed for one day. The townspeople dug her grave, built her coffin, and held a service in the new schoolhouse. The store passed to her younger sister, who had moved to Pine Ridge after the fire. The sister ran it for another 12 years, then sold it to a man from Omaha who turned it into a hardware store. That store lasted until 1960 when the interstate bypassed the town. Pine Ridge is now a ghost town. The store is a pile of weathered boards. The schoolhouse is gone. The platform where the train used to stop is overgrown, but the ledger from Martha's store survived. It is in the Nebraska State Historical Society. The entries show in her neat handwriting the debts forgiven, the prices held, the letters sent, the books loaned. It is a record of community built person by person. The general store was the heart because it was the only organ that could pump life into a scattered population. It was the gathering place, the news source, the bank, the post office, the church auxiliary, the courtroom, the nursery. It was a place where people could be seen and known. In a world of vast distances, the store was the horizon of human contact. At 4 p.m. on the 22nd of October, 1849, in the mining camp of Dry Diggings, California, a man named James W. Marshall opened a general store in a canvas tent. He had been one of the first to find gold at Sutter's Mill the previous year. He had made some money, but he was not a miner. He was a merchant. He sold pickaxes, pans, boots, whiskey, coffee, and flour. He sold at inflated prices because everything was scarce. A pound of coffee cost more than an ounce of gold. A shovel cost $10. A blanket cost $20. The miners paid, they had no choice. Marshall's store was not a community center. It was a business. He did not extend credit. He did not offer counsel. He did not write letters. He took cash or gold dust. He weighed the dust on a small brass scale. He counted the grains. He was fair, but he was not warm. The miners called him the weigher. They respected his accuracy. They did not trust him. When he closed his tent at night, he slept with a revolver under his pillow. He was robbed twice. The second time, he shot the thief in the leg. What does this contrast with Martha Klein show? It shows that the general store could be either a heart or a cash register. The difference was the storekeeper. Marshall's store was a transaction. Martha's store was a relationship. The frontier needed both, but only one built lasting communities. Marshall's camp dried up when the gold ran out. The miners moved on. The tent came down. No one remembered his name except in court records. Martha's town lasted 70 years because the store was not only about goods, it was about people. The pattern repeated across the West. Some storekeepers became the nucleus of towns that endured. Others were merchants who extracted value and left. The difference lay in the ledger. Those who kept a personal ledger, who recorded names and debts and favors and births and deaths, built something beyond themselves. Those who only recorded sales built nothing but profit. At 6:30 p.m. on the 14th of February, 1885, in the town of Clayton, New Mexico, the general store of Hiram J. Brown held a Valentine's Day dance. Brown had cleared the floor of barrels and crates. He had hung lanterns from the rafters. He had brought in a fiddler from Amarillo. The dance lasted until midnight. Young couples courted under the porch. Married couples reminded themselves why they had married. The store had become a ballroom. Brown did not charge admission. He sold lemonade and cookies for a penny each. He made enough to cover the cost of the lantern oil. The dance was not a business venture. It was a gift to the town. Clayton had no other meeting place large enough. The church was too small. The schoolhouse was unfinished. The store was the only space that could hold 60 people. Brown understood that his store was not a store at night. It was a community hall. This ability to shift function was the store's genius. By day, it was a market. By night, it was a theater, a courtroom, a polling place, a funeral parlor. In the morning, the same floor that had held a coffin the night before held sacks of flour. The store was a shape-shifter. It adapted to the needs of the moment. The frontier had no dedicated spaces for celebration or mourning. The general store filled both. The store's physical layout reinforced its role. The counter was the boundary. On one side, the storekeeper controlled the goods. On the other side, the customer had needs. But the stove was neutral. The chairs around it were neutral. At the stove, people could talk without buying. They could argue politics. They could tell stories. They could sit in silence. The stove made the store a second home. Some men spent entire afternoons there, whittling, spitting, watching the door. The storekeeper did not mind. The stove was a magnet. The magnet drew the people who would buy tomorrow. At 11 a.m. on the 9th of July, 1910, in the town of Archer, Idaho, the general store of Sarah J. Foster was the site of a town election. The sheriff had been accused of taking bribes. The county commission called a special election. They needed a polling place. The school was closed for summer. The church was being painted. Sarah offered the store. She moved the pickle barrel to one side. The polling officials set up a table near the thread spools. The ballot box was a wooden crate with a padlock. The voting went all day. Sarah did not close the store. She kept selling, but she also watched. She made sure no one voted twice. She knew each face. The election was close. The sheriff lost by 4 votes. The sheriff's supporters accused Sarah of fraud. They claimed she had allowed ineligible voters. An investigation was held. The investigators interviewed Sarah. She told them she had recorded the name of every voter in her ledger along with the time they voted. She showed them the page. The list was complete. The sheriff's supporters dropped the challenge. Sarah's ledger had saved the election. What does this reveal? It reveals that the storekeeper's record-keeping was a public trust. The ledger was not just a business document. It was a civic document. It recorded debts and credits, but it also recorded births, deaths, marriages, arrivals, departures, and votes. The storekeeper was the unofficial historian. When the census came every 10 years, the enumerator often started at the store. The storekeeper could tell him who lived in every house and how many children they had. The general store was a repository of data. In an age before databases, the storekeeper's memory was the archive. He could recall who owed what, who had borrowed a tool, who was sick, who had moved away, who had died. This knowledge was not just practical, it was the fabric of community. Without it, the town would have been a cluster of strangers. With it, the town was a family. At 3 p.m. on the 5th of November 1921 in the town of Delphos, Ohio, the general store of William H. Kincaid closed for the last time. Kincaid had been in business for 43 years. He was 71 years old. He had no successor. His children had moved to cities. The store was losing money. A new chain store had opened 3 blocks away. The chain store offered lower prices and better selection. Kincaid could not compete. He sold his inventory at a loss. He locked the door. He handed the key to the landlord. The landlord turned the building into a dry cleaning shop. Kincaid's closing was not unique. It happened in thousands of towns across America in the 192s and 193s rows. The automobile and the paved road made it possible for rural people to drive to larger towns where prices were lower. The mail-order catalog made it possible to buy goods without leaving home. The chain store, with its central purchasing and standardized prices, undercut the local store. The general store, once the heart of the frontier, became a relic. But the heart does not just stop, it changes. The function of the general store did not disappear, it dispersed. The bank took over the lending, the post office took over the mail, the telephone company took over the communication, the supermarket took over the groceries, the hardware store took over the tools, each specialized. The general store's monopoly on all functions shattered, yet something was lost. The trust that came from knowing the storekeeper personally, the credit that was extended on a handshake, the advice that was given freely, the gossip that was shared at the stove. These could not be replicated by a chain store manager who did not live in town, who did not attend the same church, who did not know your children's names. The general store was replaced by efficiency, but efficiency is not community. The legacy remains in the small towns that still have a local store. Some are called mercantiles, some are called trading posts. They are often run by families. They still have the stove. They still have the chairs. They still have the ledger, though it may be a computer now. The fundamental relationship is the same. The storekeeper knows the customer. The customer trusts the storekeeper. That is the heart. At 8 p.m. on the 31st of December, 1899, in the town of Bannack, Montana, the general store of Thomas J. Davis held a New Year's Eve celebration. Bannack was a fading gold camp. The mines were nearly empty. The population had fallen from 3,000 to 200. The town was dying. Davis knew this. He had seen other camps die. He decided to give the town one last celebration. He decorated the store with pine boughs and candles. He brought out a barrel of whiskey. He played a fiddle until his fingers bled. The townspeople danced and sang. At midnight, they rang the bell that hung above the door. They hugged each other. They cried. By March of 1900, Bannack was a ghost town. Davis moved to Butte. He opened a hardware store there. He died in 1912. The Bannack store was abandoned. It stood empty for decades. The roof collapsed. The floor rotted. The wind blew through the cracks. But the bell that rang at midnight was still there. It was found by a historian in 1967. It is now in a museum. It is not a large bell. It is small and cracked, but it rang for the last heartbeat of a town. The general store was the heart. When the heart stopped, the town died. But the memory of the heart, the stories of the storekeepers, the ledgers, the dances, the debts forgiven, the fires fought, the children taught, the letters sent, the trust maintained, all of that remains. It remains in the historical societies, in the family archives, in the novels, in the photographs. It remains because the general store was not just a building. It was an idea. The idea that a community could be built around a counter and a stove. The idea that a single person could hold a town together. The idea that the frontier was not conquered by guns and laws alone, but by flour and coffee and thread and trust. At 2:15 a.m. on the 8th of July, 1924, a neighbor in Dyersville, Iowa, noticed a glow through the front window of the Jenkins General Store. The store had been in operation since 1873, run by the Jenkins family for 2 generations. The neighbor ran to the fire station, a small shed with a hand pump cart. The volunteer fire crew assembled by 2:30 a.m. The fire had already spread to the roof. The men pulled hoses from the town well, but water pressure was weak. Flames consumed the structure. By 2:45 a.m. the roof collapsed. The fire burned until dawn. When the embers cooled, the store was a blackened shell. What survived? The cast-iron stove, twisted but recognizable, a few nails, the stone foundation, the metal safe that held the store's ledger. The safe was still shut. The owner, William Jenkins, had inherited the store from his father. He waited until the safe was cool enough to open. He turned the handle. Inside, the ledger was a pile of ash. The pages had turned to gray dust. The ink was gone. Every record of debt and credit, every sale, every name, every promise, all erased. The implications were immediate. The Jenkins store had extended credit to nearly half the town. Farmers bought seed and tools on account. Families bought flour and coffee on account. The storekeeper recorded each transaction in the ledger. Payment was expected at harvest or when the family had cash. The ledger was the only written record. Without it, William Jenkins had no way to prove who owed what. He could not collect. He could not pay his own suppliers. The store had no insurance that covered fire loss of records. The loss was total. By the end of July, Jenkins declared bankruptcy. He sold the land to a grain elevator company. He moved to Chicago, where he worked as a clerk in a warehouse. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the system itself. The general store operated on trust, but trust required memory. The ledger was the physical memory of the community. When it burned, the memory burned. The storekeeper's word, once backed by the ledger, had no legal standing without it. The system had no backup. There was no carbon copy. There was no county record. There was only the handwritten accounts in a single book. The store was the bank, but it had no vault of numbers beyond that ledger. This fragility was not unique to Dyersville. It was the reality of every town that relied on credit. The ledger system had evolved naturally. When a customer entered a store, the storekeeper wrote down the item, the price, and the date. At the end of the month or the season, the customer paid what they could. The storekeeper added interest if payment was late, but often waived it for trusted families. The ledger was the cornerstone of the local economy. It was also the most vulnerable piece of paper in town. Fires were common. Kerosene lamps overturned. Wood stoves sparked. Chimneys caught fire. The general store, filled with dry goods and kindling, burned faster than any other building. The loss of a ledger was a catastrophe that could destroy a store. Investigators later estimated that in the 190s alone, more than 200 general stores in the Midwest burned down with their ledgers inside. The fire in Dyersville was one of many. But it illustrates a deeper truth. The general store's system of trust was built on a single point of failure. The storekeeper was the bank, the record keeper, the judge, and the enforcer. When that system broke, it broke completely. The response to such vulnerabilities was slow but real. By the late 190s, some storekeepers began using duplicate ledgers. They kept one copy at home or in a bank vault. Others switched to carbon copy receipt books, giving each customer a duplicate for their own records. A few storekeepers began using metal filing cabinets instead of wooden shelves. But these changes came too late for most. The Great Depression arrived in 1929, and many stores closed anyway. At 9 a.m. on the 15th of March, 1933, in the town of Camden, South Carolina, the general store of the Gadsden family held a public auction. The store had been in business since 1884. The bank had called in the owner's loans. The shelves were still stocked with goods, but the credit system had collapsed. Farmers had no cash. The store could not pay its wholesalers. The auctioneer sold everything: barrels of nails, bolts of calico, jars of preserves, the stove, the chairs, the counter, the ledger. The ledger was sold to a collector for $2. It ended up in a university archive. It still survives today. Researchers have used it to study the economic history of the rural South. The ledger shows patterns of debt, repayment cycles, and the names of families who struggled through the Depression. It is a record of survival. The Gadsden store's auction was not unusual. Across the country, general stores were liquidated. The chain store had already taken the easy business. The Depression took the rest. But the ledger survived in many cases, and it became a historical artifact. What had been a tool of commerce became a resource for understanding a vanished world. One study of ledgers from the 1880s in Kansas found that the average customer had a balance of $15, equivalent to about $400 today. Farmers would settle their accounts twice a year, after spring planting and after fall harvest. The storekeeper extended credit based on character, not collateral. If a family had a good reputation, they could buy on trust. If a family defaulted, the storekeeper would often write off the debt rather than take them to court. The social cost of suing a neighbor was higher than the financial loss. The ledger shows these write-offs as a simple note: canceled, no explanation. What happened to the storekeeper when the ledger was lost or when the store closed? In many cases, the storekeeper returned to farming or moved to a city. Some opened hardware stores or dry goods shops that specialized in a single category. The skills they had learned, bookkeeping, customer relations, inventory management, were transferable. But the role of community anchor was not. No one else filled it. The general store's decline also shifted the locus of information. Before the store, news traveled by word of mouth, by traveling preachers, by the occasional newspaper that arrived weeks late. At the store, news arrived daily. The storekeeper sorted the mail, read the headlines, and repeated them. He was the first to know about crop prices, railroad schedules, political decisions, and scandals. When the store closed, that flow of information slowed. The town lost its central nervous system. At 4:30 p.m. on the 21st of July, 1942, in the town of Kimball, Nebraska, the general store of Andrew P. Miller closed its doors for the last time. Miller was 78 years old. He had no children who wanted to take over. The store had been losing money since the 193s rose. The town itself was shrinking. Young people had moved to Denver or Omaha for factory work during the war. The remaining population was old. Miller sold the building to a farmer who used it for grain storage. The store's interior was gutted. The counters were broken up for firewood. The stove was sold to a scrapyard. The ledger, Miller's last ledger, covering 1938 to 1942, was thrown into a trash bin. A neighbor retrieved it. He kept it in his basement for 40 years. When he died, his daughter donated it to the State Historical Society. The ledger shows the final years of a dying town. Fewer and fewer entries, more cancellations, the names of families who had moved away, the last purchases of elderly residents who died. The final entry, dated July 21, 1942, is a sack of flour sold to a woman named Clara Benson. She paid in cash. The entry shows no credit. The era of trust had ended. Why does this matter? The general store was not merely a business. It was a social contract. The storekeeper extended trust and the community repaid it with loyalty. The ledger was the physical record of that contract. When the store closed, the contract ended. The community had to find new ways to connect. The automobile became the mechanism of connectivity, but it was not the same. The store had been a fixed point around which all other activities revolved. The automobile made the town a point on a road, not a destination. The documentary record of these ledgers remains a vital resource. Historians have used them to reconstruct family histories, economic patterns, and social networks. In some cases, they have uncovered stories of forgotten individuals. A freed slave who opened a store in Reconstruction-era Alabama. a woman who ran a store while her husband fought in the Civil War, a Jewish immigrant who served a predominantly Christian farming community. Each ledger tells a story not just of goods sold, but of trust extended and repaid. One such story comes from the ledger of Moses Cohen, who opened a general store in the town of Barnwell, South Carolina in 1866. Cohen was a Jewish immigrant from Poland. He arrived in America in 1860, fought for the Union Army, and after the war moved south. He set up a store in a freedmen's community. His ledger, now held by the Library of Congress, shows that he extended credit to former slaves who had no money. He recorded their names, their purchases, and their payments. Many paid in kind: eggs, firewood, labor. Cohen's store survived for 20 years. When he died in 1886, his ledger showed that all but two of his customers had eventually paid their debts. The two who did not were noted as deceased with a cross mark. The ledger was a record of redemption. The general store was the heart of the frontier town not because it sold goods, but because it held trust. The ledger was the heart's rhythm. The stove was the warmth. The chairs were the listening. The counter was the boundary between commerce and community. When the stove went cold, when the ledger burned, when the chairs were empty, the heart stopped. But the story of that heart remains in the records, in the museums, in the memories of those who remember the sound of the bell above the door. At 6 p.m. on the 14th of December 2009, the last general store in the town of Prairie City, Oregon, closed. It had been in operation since 187 The owner, a woman named Martha Higgins, was 82 years old. She had no buyer. The building was sold to a nonprofit that turned it into a small museum. The shelves were preserved. The stove was still there. The ledger from 1923 to 1932 was found in a back room. It was yellowed and fragile. The pages had been glued together by time. A conservation team separated them. The entries were still legible. They showed the names of families who had long since moved away, the prices of goods that cost a few cents, the notations of births and deaths. One entry from December 24, 1924, reads, £1 of sugar, no charge, for the Collins baby. The baby had been born 4 days earlier. The storekeeper had given the sugar as a gift. The ledger recorded the charity. That entry is a small thing. It is one line among thousands, but it captures the essence of the general store. The storekeeper was not only a merchant, he was a neighbor. The sugar was not a sale, it was a gesture. The ledger recorded the gesture as a debt canceled before it was ever due. That is the heart. That is the legacy. The general store was where people went to buy, but also where they went to belong. At 7 a.m. on the 12th of June, 1892, in the town of Dodge City, Kansas, the general store of John Mueller opened for business as usual. Mueller unlocked the front door at 6:45, swept the wooden porch, and lit the pot-bellied stove. By 7:15, the first customer arrived, a rancher named Frank Bennett who needed nails and a new axe handle. Mueller wrote the sale in his ledger, took the cash, and made change. Everything seemed normal. Only a few minutes later, something was off. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the back storeroom. At 7:30, Mueller smelled it. He walked to the rear of the store, pushed open the storeroom door, and saw flames climbing the wall behind a stack of burlap sacks filled with grain. He shouted to Bennett to run for help. Then he grabbed a bucket of water from the washstand. He threw it. The flame hissed but did not die. The fire had already spread into the ceiling joists. What happened? The fire spread rapidly. The building was dry pine built in 1873. The storeroom held oil lamps, kerosene, gunpowder, and cotton cloth. Within minutes, the fire had engulfed the back half of the store. Bennett returned with 4 men from the livery stable. They formed a bucket brigade from the well in the street. But the well was shallow and the water was low. Each bucket took 20 seconds to fill and pass. The flames grew faster than the water could be thrown. By 8:15, the roof collapsed. Mueller stood across the street watching. His ledger was still inside. His inventory of $3,000, roughly $90,000 in today's money, was gone. His customer credit records with 47 outstanding accounts were lost. The store was a total loss. Investigators arrived from the county seat the next day. They examined the site. The fire had started near a coal oil lamp that Mueller had left burning in the storeroom. The lamp had been knocked over, possibly by a rat or by vibration from a passing wagon. The glass chimney had broken and the fuel had ignited the burlap sacks. Mueller had no insurance. He had been a storekeeper for 19 years, but he had never thought to buy a policy. The cost seemed too high. He had trusted his building and his careful habits. That trust was misplaced. The fire was an accident, but the lack of insurance turned it into a catastrophe. The town of Dodge City had grown around Mueller's store. He had opened in 1873, when the town was a rough cattle shipping point. He had sold whiskey, ammunition, canned goods, and fabric. He had extended credit to cowboys, farmers, and prostitutes. He had hosted the first town council meeting in his back room in 1876. He had loaned money to the church for a new roof. The store was not just a business. It was the social and economic anchor of the block. When it burned, the anchor broke. Mueller could not rebuild. He had no capital. He moved to Wichita and took a job as a clerk in a dry goods store. He died in 1901, a forgotten man. How could this have happened? The same question applies to thousands of frontier towns. The general store was often the only commercial building with both dry goods and fuel. Kerosene lamps, gunpowder, and hay or grain made a lethal combination. Fires were common. In 1888, a fire in the general store of Copper Creek, Montana, destroyed half the town. In 1895, a fire in the store of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, killed 3 people. The stores were built close together, with no fire codes, no fire hydrants, and no professional fire departments. The bucket brigade was all that stood between a small fire and a town catastrophe. That brigade often failed. The loss of Mueller's ledger was a deeper wound. The ledger contained not only financial records but personal histories. When it burned, so did the memory of who owed what, who had paid, and who had been forgiven. Some customers could pay their debts, but without the ledger, Mueller could not prove the balance. Others could claim they had already paid, and Mueller had no way to dispute it. The ledger was the contract. Without it, trust evaporated. The community was left with only memory and reputation. In the following months, several customers took advantage of the confusion. They stopped paying their accounts. Mueller tried to track them down by word of mouth, but many had moved on. The fire destroyed not just wood and goods, but the social fabric that held the town together. Why does this matter? The general store fire at Dodge City is not a famous event. It is not recorded in history books. But it is a microcosm of a broader fragility. The frontier economy ran on trust, but that trust was stored in paper and wood. When the paper burned, the trust burned with it. The fire also reveals the vulnerability of the storekeeper. He was the center of the community, but he had no safety net. His investments were physical and local. He could not diversify. A fire, a flood, a tornado, or a depression could wipe him out in a single day. And when he was wiped out, the whole town felt the shock. In 1892, the town of Dodge City recovered. A new general store opened the following year, owned by a man named Charles Rath. But it was not the same. The new store had iron shutters and a brick firewall. It sold the same goods, but it did not have Mueller's memory. The customers did not trust Rath the way they had trusted Mueller. Trust is built over years, not months. Rath struggled for a decade before selling to a chain grocery in 1905. By then, Dodge City had a railroad depot, a hotel, 2 saloons, and a bank. The general store was no longer the heart. The bank had become the new center. Money, not trust, now dictated the town's rhythm. This shift was happening across the West. The general store was being replaced by institutions that could survive fire, fraud, and failure. Banks had vaults and insurance. Chain stores had centralized purchasing and standardized prices. The general store was a relic of a time when a handshake and a ledger were enough. But a handshake cannot survive a fire. A ledger can be destroyed. The modern economy demanded something more durable. The transition was not violent, but it was final. One other detail from the Dodge City fire. Amidst the debris, Mueller's daughter, age 14, found a small metal box. Inside was a photograph of her mother, who had died of typhoid in 1885, and a Bible with a handwritten note inside the front cover. The note read, "To my daughter, always keep faith in God and in your neighbors." The photograph was singed. The Bible was water-stained but intact. The note was still readable. That box was the only thing Mueller saved. He carried it to Wichita. It sits today in a museum, a tiny artifact of a lost world. The story of the general store is often romanticized, but the reality was harsher. The storekeeper worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. He dealt with drunks, thieves, and desperate families. He had to balance generosity with survival. He had to decide who was worthy of credit and who was not. He wrote off debts that could not be collected. He watched children die and families leave. He kept the ledger, but the ledger could not keep him. When the store burned or closed, he was often left with nothing. At 10:30 p.m. on the 18th of October 1910, in the town of Laramie, Wyoming, another general store burned. This one was owned by a woman named Sarah Porter. She had run the store since her husband died in 1903. She had raised 3 children in the back room. She had extended credit to miners and railroad workers. Her ledger was saved. She grabbed it as she fled the fire. But the building was lost. She used the ledger to collect outstanding debts and reopened in a smaller location a year later. She ran that store until 1927 when she retired. Her ledger, now in the University of Wyoming archives, shows more than just debts. It shows a community, a note that a family had moved away, a mark that a child had died, a smiley face drawn by a customer who paid off a year-old balance. The ledger was not just a record of commerce. It was a diary of a town. Sarah Porter's story is exceptional. Most storekeepers did not recover from a fire. Most did not have the stamina to rebuild. But her store survived because she had the ledger. She had the trust recorded in ink. She could prove who owed what and she could demand payment. The ledger was her capital. Without it, she would have been like John Mueller, a man standing in the ashes, holding a Bible and a photograph, watching his life disappear. The Frontier General Store was the heart of the town because it was the place where trust was stored. The ledger was the heart's record. The stove was the pulse. The chairs were the lungs. When the store burned, the town lost its pulse. But the ledger, if saved, could keep the story alive. That is why these documents matter. They are the only witness to a world that disappeared. They show the names, the debts, the cancellations, the gifts. They capture the ordinary acts of kindness and survival that built the American West. The fire in Dodge City on June 12, 1892, is one of thousands. It is not unique, but it is a reminder that the general store was never just a building. It was a fragile contract between a storekeeper and a community. And when that contract was broken, the town had to learn a new way to live. The storekeeper became a clerk. The ledger became a bank account. The heart became a vault, and the bell above the door stopped ringing. At 10 a.m. on the 5th of May, 1893, in the town of Ellsworth, Kansas, the general store of James R. Thompson closed its doors for the last time. It was a Thursday morning. A handwritten note was tacked to the front window. It read, "Closed due to circumstances beyond my control. God bless you all." There was no crowd, no protest, no ceremony. The bell above the door did not ring because the door was not opened. The store simply stopped. What happened? The Panic of 1893 had begun 2 months earlier in February, when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt. By May, a wave of bank failures had swept the country. In Ellsworth, the local bank, the Ellsworth County Savings Bank, had suspended operations on the 2nd of May. It was a small institution, but it held the deposits of nearly every merchant and farmer in the area. James R. Thompson had kept his store's cash and credit lines there, as did every other storekeeper in town. When the bank closed, the money was frozen. Thompson could not pay his wholesale suppliers in Chicago. His inventory of flour, sugar, coffee, and boots had been bought on credit. Those bills came due in April. He had paid some in early May, but the checks bounced when the bank closed. The suppliers stopped shipping. The store had no goods to sell. Within 3 days, Thompson was out of business. He had run the store for 21 years. He had arrived in Ellsworth in 1872 when it was still a cattle town. He had built the store himself, adding a second floor for his family. He had weathered droughts, blizzards, and 2 fires in neighboring buildings. He had extended credit to farmers who had lost their crops to grasshoppers. He had given free sacks of corn to widows. His ledger, still preserved at the Kansas State Historical Society, shows hundreds of accounts, many with no balance, canceled by a single word: forgiven. The ledger also shows that in 1893, Thompson had over $4,000 in outstanding credit, a large sum for the time. That credit was uncollectible because the farmers could not pay. The bank failure was the final blow. How could this have happened? The general store was not just a store. It was the town's de facto bank. Storekeepers like Thompson extended credit without interest, often without formal contracts, relying on trust and a handshake. But trust is vulnerable to external forces. The Panic of 1893 was a national crisis caused by railroad overbuilding, silver speculation, and international trade imbalances. It was not something a small town in Kansas could control. Yet the general store, being the economic heart of the town, felt the crisis first and hardest. When the bank failed, the store failed. When the store failed, the town lost its source of provisions, credit, and community. The aftermath in Ellsworth was typical of the era. With the store closed, residents had to travel 20 miles to the next town for supplies. Some families could not afford the trip and went without salt, coffee, or medicine. Farmers who had not yet harvested their spring wheat had no way to buy seed for the fall. The store had also been the post office. Mail now had to be routed through the railroad depot, which was only open during train arrivals. The social fabric frayed. Without a central meeting place, neighbors saw each other less often. The town's population dropped from 800 in 1890 to less than 400 by 1895. Investigators did not come to Ellsworth. There was no official inquiry into the store's closure, but historians have reconstructed the timeline. The bank had been overextended in loans to local ranchers, who defaulted when beef prices collapsed in 1892. The bank's manager had concealed losses for months by moving deposits between accounts. When depositors learned the truth, they ran. Thompson had withdrawn $500 on the 2nd of May, but the bank told him there was a temporary hold. By the time he learned the hold was permanent, the bank had closed. The system failed because banking regulation was almost non-existent in the frontier. Banks operated without federal insurance, without reserve requirements, without oversight. The general store, which had no capital reserves of its own, was entirely dependent on the bank. When the bank fell, the store fell. James R. Thompson tried to reopen 6 months later. He secured a small loan from a relative in Ohio and bought a limited stock of goods. He reopened in a rented room above a saloon in January 1894. But the location was poor, the inventory was thin, and many former customers had left town. He ran the store for another 3 years, but it never regained its former scale. In 1897, he sold what remained to a traveling merchant and moved to Colorado. He died in 1904, buried in an unmarked grave near Denver. His ledger, saved by a local historian, is the only record of his life's work. Why does this matter? The closure of Thompson's store in Ellsworth was not unique. It was one of thousands of general store failures during the Panic of 1893. The panic lasted 4 years and put an estimated 15,000 businesses out of operation across the West. Most of those businesses were general stores, but the loss of a general store was more than a business failure. It was the loss of a community center. The store was where news was exchanged, where decisions were made, where credit was given, where charity was dispensed. When the store closed, the town's social and economic heart stopped. The questions that remain are uncomfortable. Could the store have survived with better financial planning? Thompson had kept no separate emergency fund. He had invested all his capital in inventory and credit. He had been generous, but generosity does not pay wholesalers. Could the bank have been saved? Possibly, if federal regulation had existed. But the frontier was built on risk, and risk had no safety net. The general store was a bet that the community would survive and grow. When the economy turned, the bet was lost. In the years that followed, Ellsworth slowly recovered. A new general store opened in 1898, owned by a man named Carl Grimes, who built a brick building with a metal roof and a safe. He did not extend as much credit. He demanded cash or barter. He kept his money under the floorboards. He survived the panic of 1907 and the Depression. But his store was not the same as Thompson's. It was colder, more transactional. The trust was gone. The heart had been replaced by a cash register. The story of James R. Thompson is a reminder that the general store was never just a building. It was a contract between a storekeeper and a community. That contract was written in a ledger, but it was sealed by trust. When the contract broke, the community had to learn to live with less trust, and some communities never fully recovered. The bell above the door stopped ringing, and the silence was the sound of a world that could not be saved. At 8:15 a.m. on the 12th of November, 1893, in the town of Medicine Lodge, Kansas, the general store of Henry Bates was auctioned off on the courthouse steps. It was a Sunday morning. The temperature was just above freezing. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 40 people, mostly farmers and their wives. The auctioneer stood on a wooden crate. He held up a ledger, a set of scales, a bolt of calico. One by one, the items were sold for pennies on the dollar. The store itself, a 2-story frame building with a false front, went to a grain buyer from Wichita for $300. Henry Bates stood at the back of the crowd, hat in hand, watching. He did not bid. When the last item was gone, the crowd dispersed. The new owner boarded up the windows. The store never reopened as a general store. It became a feed warehouse. The heart of Medicine Lodge had stopped. What happened? The panic of 1893 had reached Medicine Lodge in June. The local bank, the Medicine Valley Trust, had failed on the 3rd of June. It was a smaller institution than the one in Ellsworth, but it had held the deposits of nearly every family within a 20-mile radius. Henry Bates had kept his store's cash in a locked box under the counter, not in the bank. He had learned from the failure of another store in a neighboring town 2 years earlier. But his wholesale suppliers did not trust cash. They wanted credit references. When the bank failed, Bates could not get letters of credit from any other bank. The supply houses in Kansas City cut him off. His inventory dwindled through the summer. By October, he had no flour, no sugar, no coffee, no boots. He tried to barter with farmers, but the farmers had nothing to trade. The wheat crop had failed due to drought in 1892, and the corn crop was only half its normal size. The farmers had spent their savings on seed that did not germinate. Bates had extended credit to 43 families. Their debts totaled nearly $2,000. He knew he would never collect that money. He closed the store on the 1st of November. The sheriff seized the building for back taxes on the 10th. The auction was set for the 12th. How could this have happened? The drought of 1892 was a natural disaster that no one could have predicted, but the vulnerability of the general store went deeper. Bates had no contract with his suppliers beyond a handshake. He had no insurance. He had no backup source of credit. The entire economy of Medicine Lodge depended on a single bank, a single railroad line, and a single crop wheat. When the wheat failed and the bank failed, the store had no margin for survival. The system was not designed for resilience. It was designed for boom or bust. Investigators did not come to Medicine Lodge. There was no investigation. The sheriff's records show only the auction list. 1 counter, 2 shelves, 1 stove, 1 ledger, 1 set of weights, 1 broken clock. The clock had stopped at 7:23 p.m. on the 30th of October. That was the last time Bates wound it. The silence of that stopped clock was the same silence that settled over the town. Without the store, there was no place to gather, no place to exchange news, no place to borrow a cup of sugar or ask for help. The community fragmented, families moved away. By 1900, Medicine Lodge had lost half its population. The general store never returned. Why does this matter? Henry Bates was not a bad businessman. He was a man who trusted the system that had been built around him. That system, frontier capitalism, was fragile. It relied on trust, on weather, on national markets far beyond local control. When those forces turned against the store, there was no safety net. The store was the heart of the town, and the heart could not protect itself. The bell above the door did not ring on that November morning. It had been silent for days, and the silence was the sound of a